HOA Karen killed my wife, then stole my solar power, so I set a 50-kilowatt trap and watched her fry. It all started when I begged HOA Karen to spare my wife's life. We were sitting in her home office when she said, "I understand your situation, but generators are eyesores." I sighed. "You see, my wife has muscular dystrophy and needs a machine to survive. But if the power ever went out, the machine would shut off and my wife would die. Unless we had a backup power generator. Please," I said. "My wife could die without this. Property values affect everyone in this neighborhood. I have to think about the greater good." 2 months later, the power went out during a summer storm. I held my wife's hand in the dark as her ventilator slowly died, and by the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. At her funeral, Karen had the audacity to tell me she was sorry for my loss. The same woman who had signed my wife's death sentence stood there checking her phone between condolences. The rage I felt in that moment could have burned down the entire neighborhood, but I had an 8-year-old daughter who'd just watched her mother die. So instead of revenge, I chose something else. I chose to never let it happen again. For 2 years, I became obsessed. Every weekend, every paycheck went into building a solar battery system that could never fail and always keep my power on. It was around this time that I woke up to Karen knocking on my door. "That's quite the setup you have," she said, trying to peer around me into the house. "Must have cost a fortune." "It did," I said flatly. "Seems like overkill for one family," she continued. "All those batteries just sitting there. Have you thought about sharing with the community during outages?" "No," I said, and closed the door. Then my monitoring app started showing something strange. Every night at around 2 a.m., my battery levels would drop significantly, way more than our normal usage. That's when I found it. A heavy-duty cable, buried shallow along my fence line, leading straight to Karen's property. This same woman who had literally let my wife die, was now stealing the power I'd installed to protect my family. I went inside and pulled up the detailed logs. She'd been stealing from me for 3 weeks. Every single night, like clockwork, draining 30 to 40% of my battery capacity. The data showed she was running her hot tub, her wine fridge, even charging her Tesla. Thousands of dollars worth of equipment meant to keep my family safe, and she was using it for her luxury items. The next morning, I knocked on her door with the evidence. I thought maybe, just maybe, seeing it all laid out would make her realize what she'd done. I even offered to let it slide if she'd just stop and pay me back for what she'd taken. She looked at the papers, looked at me, and actually laughed. "You really think I'm paying you for sunlight?" she said. "The sun belongs to everyone." Then she slammed the door in my face. That's when I knew this wasn't going to end with reason or fairness. So I spent 3 nights in my workshop, designing something special. A decoy charging port rigged with variable voltage. Nothing lethal, just enough to fry whatever got plugged into it. I even put up a bright yellow sign, "Private grid, do not use." I knew she'd ignore it. While I worked, Karen was busy spreading poison. My daughter came home from school crying because Karen's granddaughter said her mommy was a liar. That night, as I held her and promised everything would be okay, I made the final connections. The next morning, a violation notice appeared in my mailbox. Karen had scheduled an emergency HOA meeting at her house to vote on mandatory power sharing. The date she picked? The 3-year anniversary of my first wife's death. When the night arrived, I watched through my security cameras as her house blazed with stolen power. At 7 p.m., I sat at my control panel. My finger hovered over the discharge regulator. I thought about forgetting it. Then I thought about my daughter asking if the bad lady would hurt her new mommy too. I pushed the button. 50 kilowatt hours of chaos flooded her jerry-rigged system. Her house lit up like lightning, then died. Every circuit fried in a cascade of failure. First came silence. I expected screams to follow, but they never did. I waited 10 minutes before walking over, and when I knocked on her door, I saw something I never expected. Turns out, I had gone too far. I stood on Catherine's porch with my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The smell of burnt plastic and ozone hung in the air like a warning I should have listened to hours ago. Around me in the darkness, confused HOA meeting people were walking around with their phone flashlights, talking in low voices and pointing at Catherine's house. The silence I expected never came. Instead, there were voices asking what happened and someone coughing hard somewhere near the front door. I realized with a feeling like ice water in my stomach that I needed to see what my 50-kilowatt surge actually did to her house and to these people. My hands shook as I reached up to knock on the door. I wasn't sure anymore if I was the victim who had every right to protect his property or if I was something much worse. Catherine opened the door, and she looked shaken, but not hurt, which made me feel relief for about 2 seconds. Then I looked past her and saw a scorched electrical outlet near her breaker panel, with black marks spreading up the wall like fingers. The relief flooding through me that no one seemed badly injured got replaced immediately by cold fear when I noticed smoke detectors beeping throughout her house and a thin haze of smoke in the air. The other neighbors were staring at me now. I could see them doing the math in their heads, remembering my big solar system and the fight Catherine and I had been having. Their faces were starting to change from confused to suspicious. Before anyone could start asking me questions directly, I pulled out my phone and called 911 myself. My voice sounded steadier than I felt as I gave them Catherine's address. I explained there was a power surge that damaged the electrical system and we needed emergency services because of fire risk. Catherine's eyes got wide with surprise when she heard me making the call. I couldn't tell if she was grateful I was taking responsibility or suspicious about why I was doing it. But at least in this moment, I was doing the right thing for safety, even though I was the one who caused the danger. The fire department showed up within 8 minutes, which felt like forever, while I stood there with neighbors staring at me and whispering. EMTs came in first and immediately started checking everyone for smoke-breathing problems, while firefighters went straight to Catherine's electrical panel. One older neighbor who had been sitting closest to the damaged outlet was coughing really badly. They got him oxygen treatment right there in the front yard, putting the mask on his face while he sat on the grass. I watched from the sidewalk, feeling sick to my stomach. My trap could have killed someone just like the power outage killed my first wife 3 years ago. The awful irony of that burned worse than any electrical fire could. Fire investigator Jonah Henderson arrived in a red pickup truck and spent 20 minutes walking around examining the damage. He took photos of the scorched outlet and the breaker panel that blew with a serious expression on his face. Then he noticed the heavy-duty cable running from outside Catherine's house. He followed it with his flashlight, walking slowly along the fence line until he got to my property. That's when he spotted my bright yellow sign that said, "Private grid, do not use at the connection point." His face got hard as stone when he turned back to look at me standing there. I knew right then that my defensive trap had just become evidence of me deliberately hurting someone instead of just protecting my property. 2 police officers started taking statements from everyone who was there. I watched Catherine point at me while she talked really fast and moved her hands around. I was too far away to hear exactly what she was saying, but I could read her body language. She was talking about sabotage and attempted murder. My stomach dropped like I was falling. This wasn't going to be a simple property fight anymore. This could be criminal charges. When the officer walked over to me with his notebook out, I decided being honest was my only choice now. I admitted straight up that I installed a decoy charging port after Catherine stole power from my system for 3 weeks. I showed the police officer my monitoring logs right there on my phone. The detailed data showed 3 weeks of someone taking power without permission from 2 a.m. every night. It added up to thousands of dollars in stolen electricity. The officer's face changed from suspicious to interested as he scrolled through the timestamps and usage patterns I had documented. But then he asked me about the variable voltage system I rigged up. I had to explain that I deliberately designed it to overload whatever got plugged into it. I watched his face close off again as he understood that I built a trap, knowing someone would set it off. Catherine exploded in front of all the gathered neighbors right there in her front yard. Her voice got high and shrill as she accused me of trying to kill her with electrical assault. She called me unstable and dangerous. She was crying now with real tears of shock and fear running down her face. Several neighbors moved over to comfort her and put their arms around her shoulders while shooting angry looks my way. I wanted to shout about her stealing my power. I wanted to scream about her letting my first wife die by denying our generator request. I wanted everyone to know she scheduled this meeting on the 3-year anniversary of my wife's death on purpose. But the words got stuck in my throat because I could see the smoke damage on her house and the elderly neighbor still on oxygen across the lawn, and I knew deep down that I had gone too far with my revenge. Movement at my own front door caught my eye. I turned and saw Hallie's scared face pressed against the living room window, with Kira holding her back from running outside to me. My 8-year-old daughter was crying and pointing at the police cars and fire trucks in the street. The sight of her fear cut through everything else like a knife going straight into my chest. Kira met my eyes with a look that was equal parts worry and disappointment. I realized right then that whatever happened with Catherine and the police, I had scared my own child again by choosing revenge over the family that was still alive and needed me. The utility company showed up in their white trucks and spent 30 minutes looking at both properties. They cut power to both Catherine's house and mine because of safety concerns about the connected systems and fire risk. Standing in my own dark house an hour later, I listened to my battery backup system kick in automatically with its familiar hum. Catherine's house stayed completely dark next door. I felt the bitter irony of being powerless despite all my engineering and all my planning and all my expensive equipment. Kira put Hallie to bed with extra nightlights in her room and didn't speak to me at all. I sat alone in my workshop staring at the control panel that let me push that button. I wondered what the hell I had become. By morning, my phone started buzzing with calls from insurance companies. I sat at the kitchen table with cold coffee, while an adjuster from my company asked questions about the electrical surge. I answered everything honestly and told him about Catherine stealing power for 3 weeks. He took notes and said someone would inspect the damage within 48 hours. Then Catherine's insurance company called me too. A different adjuster asked about my decoy charging port and whether I built it knowing someone would get hurt. I explained that I only wanted to protect my system after the theft, but I could hear doubt in his voice. He said they'd need to review everything before processing any claims. After both calls ended, I overheard Catherine talking to her adjuster through the open window between our houses. Her voice carried clearly as she paced in her yard. The adjuster must have been on speaker because I heard him say something about intentional acts and claim reservations. Those 2 words made my stomach drop like I'd swallowed ice. I pulled up my laptop and searched for what intentional acts meant for insurance coverage. Every result said the same thing. Insurance companies don't pay for damage you cause on purpose. They only cover accidents and unplanned events. My hands started shaking as I clicked through more pages. If both insurance companies decided our actions were intentional, neither of us would get coverage. Catherine installed that cable deliberately to steal my power. I built that trap deliberately to fry whatever connected to it. We both did exactly what we meant to do. I opened our bank account and looked at the balance. We had about $40,000 saved up over the past 2 years. Most of it was supposed to be for Hallie's college fund. I started doing rough math in my head about electrical repairs. Catherine's house probably needed $15,000 to $20,000 in panel replacement and circuit rewiring. My system might need another $5,000 to $8,000 in safety upgrades and inspections. If insurance denied both claims, we'd be looking at $25,000 to $30,000 out of pocket between us. My share alone could wipe out half our savings. The money I spent 2 years building to protect my family after my first wife died would be gone because I couldn't control my anger for one night. I closed the laptop and put my head in my hands. Kira came downstairs and found me like that. She poured herself coffee and sat across from me without saying anything. I told her about the insurance calls and the intentional acts problem. She nodded slowly, like she'd been expecting this. Then she showed me her phone. The neighborhood HOA group chat had blown up overnight with hundreds of messages. I'd been ignoring that chat for months because it was always full of complaints about lawn heights and parking violations. But now my name was everywhere. Kira scrolled through and let me read over her shoulder. Some neighbors were defending me and saying Catherine had no right to steal power. They posted things like, he was protecting his property, and she got what she deserved for being a thief. One guy named Marcus wrote a long message about property rights and how the HOA couldn't force people to share private resources. But other neighbors were calling me dangerous and unstable. A woman named Patricia wrote that I deliberately tried to burn down Catherine's house with people inside. Another neighbor demanded that the HOA remove me from the neighborhood before I hurt someone else. Someone else posted that they didn't feel safe living near me anymore. The chat kept updating with new messages every few seconds. People were taking sides and arguing with each other. Friends who'd lived next to each other for years were now fighting about whether I was justified or criminal. The whole community was splitting down the middle because of my private war with Catherine. I watched the message count climb past 300. Kira pulled her phone back and locked the screen. She said the neighborhood had never been this divided about anything. Even when they argued about the annual budget or the playground equipment, people eventually compromised. But this was different. This was personal, and people were choosing teams. I realized that my revenge against Catherine had stopped being private the moment those fire trucks showed up. Now everyone in the neighborhood was involved whether they wanted to be or not. I spent the entire day in my workshop backing up every piece of data I had. I started with the monitoring logs and downloaded 3 weeks of power usage records showing Catherine's theft. Each file showed timestamps down to the second, battery levels, power draw amounts, and duration. The pattern was clear as day. Every night at 2 a.m., someone pulled 8 to 12 kilowatts from my system for 4 to 6 hours. I saved everything to 3 different USB drives and uploaded copies to cloud storage. Then I pulled the security camera footage from my property line. The cameras had caught Catherine's contractor installing that buried cable 2 months ago. I clipped the relevant sections and saved those files too. My hands felt steadier now that I had a concrete task. This was something I could control with engineering and documentation instead of emotion and rage. I organized everything into folders with clear labels and dates. I printed out summary reports with graphs showing the theft pattern. I made spreadsheets calculating the total stolen electricity and its dollar value based on my system costs. The documentation grew into a thick binder with tabs and page numbers. Every fact was backed up with timestamps and data. Every claim had evidence attached. I worked through lunch and into the afternoon without stopping. Kira brought me a sandwich and watched me work for a minute. She said it was good that I was being systematic about this instead of just reacting. I told her I learned my lesson about acting without thinking. From now on, everything would be documented before I said a word to anyone. I made copies of the entire evidence packet and stored them in different locations. One set went in our fireproof safe. Another set went to cloud storage with encryption. A third set got mailed to my brother in another state for safekeeping. I wasn't going to let anyone claim I didn't have proof or that I made things up. The monitoring data was solid. The security footage was clear. The timeline was airtight. If this went to court or arbitration or whatever came next, I'd have everything organized and ready. 2 days later, a city truck pulled up in front of my house. A man in a yellow safety vest got out carrying a clipboard and a camera. He knocked on my door and introduced himself as Hao Liu, electrical inspector assigned to investigate both properties. He had a serious expression and spoke in a calm, professional tone. He asked if he could see my solar system and battery setup. I said yes, and led him to the garage where most of the equipment was installed. Hao spent 20 minutes examining everything and taking photos. He asked detailed questions about battery capacity, inverter specifications, and monitoring systems. He wanted to know how the decoy port was wired and what voltage it could discharge. I answered everything honestly and showed him my theft documentation. I pulled up the monitoring app on my phone and walked him through 3 weeks of data showing Catherine's power theft. He studied the graphs and timestamps without any judgment on his face. He just collected facts and took notes. He asked about the yellow warning sign, and I showed him photos of it posted at the connection point. He asked when I installed the decoy port, and I told him the exact date. He asked if I knew someone would trigger it, and I admitted that yes, I built it, knowing Catherine would connect to it. Hao nodded and wrote more notes. There was something calming about his approach after all the emotional chaos. He wasn't yelling or accusing or defending anyone. He was just gathering information and documenting what happened. For the first time since I pushed that button, I felt like maybe there was still a path forward that didn't end in complete disaster. Maybe someone official would see that I was genuinely wronged before I did something wrong in response. Hao closed his notebook and said he needed to inspect Catherine's property next. But first, he needed me to disable the decoy charging port immediately. He said my entire system had to be secured until his investigation was complete. I agreed without argument. We went back to the garage and I started disconnecting the trap I'd spent 3 nights building. It took me an hour to safely remove all the wiring. I had to shut down sections of the battery array and reroute connections to bypass the decoy port completely. With every wire I removed, I felt a strange mix of relief and loss. Relief that I was taking down something dangerous. Loss that my protection was gone. The yellow warning sign came down last. I folded it carefully and stored it in my workshop next to the disconnected port components. They sat there like evidence of temporary insanity, a reminder of the line I crossed between protecting my family and causing harm to others. Hao watched me work and verified that everything was properly disabled. He took more photos and made me sign a compliance statement. Then he left to inspect Catherine's house. Over the next week, I saw Hao's truck parked at Catherine's place multiple times. He spent hours tracing that buried cable from my property line all the way to her breaker panel. I watched through my window as he measured and photographed every foot of it. He dug up sections to examine the installation quality. He took samples of the wire and documented the gauge and capacity. By Friday, he came back to my house with his findings. He showed me photos on his camera of the cable running underground across the property line. Clear evidence of unauthorized electrical connection installed without any permits or safety inspections. The cable was buried only 6 inches deep in some places, way too shallow for that voltage and amperage. Catherine or whoever she hired had done a dangerous amateur job. Hao said the connection violated multiple electrical codes and created serious fire risk even without my trap. The vindication I felt was real, but hollow. Yes, she stole from me. Yes, she did it dangerously. Yes, I had proof. But my response still put people in danger, and that truth wouldn't go away no matter how justified my anger was. Being right about her being wrong didn't make my trap any less reckless. Hao came back the next Monday and asked to see my monitoring logs again. This time, he brought his laptop and spent 2 hours analyzing the data. He pulled up my logs and cross-referenced them with the cable capacity he'd measured. He built calculations showing that Catherine was drawing 8 to 12 kilowatts every night for 3 weeks. He mapped out her usage patterns and compared them to typical household consumption. The numbers told a clear story. Someone was running major appliances and luxury items on my power: hot tub heaters, wine fridge compressors, vehicle charging, all the high-draw equipment that costs serious money to run. Hao established clear chain of custody for all the data. He made me sign statements about when I first noticed the theft and when I installed monitoring. He treated my documentation like evidence in a court case. He asked about my backup procedures and data integrity. He verified timestamps against my security camera footage. Watching him work made me feel a spark of hope. Maybe the facts would matter. Maybe someone official would see the full picture instead of just the explosion. Maybe there was still a way to show that I was wronged first, before I crossed the line. The following Wednesday, HOA came back with official paperwork. He handed me a citation for installing an unsafe device intended to cause property damage. The form listed specific code violations and included a fine amount of $3,500. It had a mandatory compliance deadline of 30 days to complete safety upgrades. My name was printed right there on an official city violation notice. Seeing it in writing made everything real in a way the police statements hadn't. I asked HOA if Catherine got cited too. He said yes. She received citations for unauthorized electrical connection and power theft. Her fine was $5,000 with the same compliance deadline. We were both wrong. We both violated codes and safety standards. The system was holding us both accountable regardless of who started it. I signed the citation and HOA gave me a copy. He explained that these would go on record and that we'd both have to appear at a code enforcement hearing in 3 weeks. He said the hearing officer would review everything and determine final penalties. Criminal charges were still possible depending on the DA's decision. I thanked him for being fair, and he nodded without smiling. He said he was just doing his job. That night, an email came through from the HOA. They were rescheduling the emergency meeting to the community center instead of Catherine's damaged house. The agenda said discussion of power-sharing policies and recent safety incidents. My stomach twisted reading it. I'd have to face all those neighbors who'd been arguing about me in the group chat. I'd have to sit in a room with people who thought I was dangerous, and people who thought I was justified, and people who just wanted the drama to end. Kira said she'd come with me for support, but her tone made it clear this was the last time she was backing me up if I didn't start making better choices about handling conflict. She said I needed to focus on solutions instead of revenge. I agreed, because I didn't want to lose her too. The next morning, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A woman introduced herself as Lucille Stockton, the counselor at Hallie's elementary school. She said she needed to schedule an emergency parent meeting about my daughter. My heart started racing. I asked if Hallie was hurt or sick. Lucille said no, but there was a situation that needed immediate attention. She explained that Catherine's granddaughter, Trudy, had been telling other kids that Hallie's dad was dangerous and tried to hurt people. The story had spread through Hallie's grade, and now other kids were avoiding her. My daughter had been eating lunch alone for 3 days. She'd been crying in the bathroom during recess. Teachers had noticed, but Hallie wouldn't talk about what was wrong. Hearing this broke something in me that anger never could. I'd been so focused on my war with Catherine that I hadn't noticed my own child suffering. I'd failed to protect her from exactly the kind of cruelty I was trying to punish. I scheduled the meeting for that afternoon and hung up feeling sick. My revenge against Catherine had turned into my 8-year-old daughter being bullied at the school. The thing I feared most after my first wife died was Hallie growing up scared and alone. Now I'd created exactly that situation by choosing revenge over my family's actual safety. That evening, after Hallie finally fell asleep with her nightlight on and 3 stuffed animals arranged around her pillow, Kira sat me down at the kitchen table. She had that look on her face, the one where her jaw was set and her eyes were clear, and I knew this wasn't going to be a gentle conversation. She told me in calm, measured words that I needed to stop building revenge solutions and start focusing on legal, safe ways to handle this mess. She said she understood my grief and anger, that she knew how much losing my first wife still hurt me, but she didn't sign up to be married to someone who builds electrical traps and scares their own kid. Her boundary was firm and clear. No more DIY justice, no more escalation, or she was taking Hallie and staying with her sister until I got myself under control. The threat of losing my second family cut through all the righteous anger I'd been carrying like a knife through paper. I nodded and promised I'd do better, and I meant it, because the alternative was losing everything that mattered. The next 2 days, I locked myself in my home office and built something different from usual. Instead of circuits and voltage regulators, I created a clear, factual evidence packet for the upcoming HOA meeting. Just the monitoring data, timestamps, and theft calculations with no angry comments or emotional language. Every time I wanted to type something about Catherine's cruelty or her role in my first wife's death, I deleted it and stuck to the numbers. The discipline was harder than any engineering project I'd ever done, forcing myself to let facts speak for themselves instead of pouring my rage into every sentence. I organized the logs chronologically, printed out graphs showing the nightly power drain, calculated the total stolen electricity in kilowatt hours and dollar amounts. Kira reviewed the packet when I finished and nodded her approval without saying much. but that quiet acknowledgement mattered more than any revenge ever could. On the third day, my phone buzzed with notifications from the neighborhood group chat. Catherine had posted a long statement calling me unstable and dangerous, describing the electrical fire risk and the elderly neighbor who needed oxygen treatment. She framed herself as a concerned community leader, trying to promote resource sharing while being targeted by an unhinged engineer with a vendetta. Reading her words made my blood pressure spike and my hands shake with anger, because she was rewriting history, completely erasing her 3 weeks of power theft and the anniversary meeting and my dead wife. But I forced myself to close the app without typing a response because engaging would only make things worse and give her ammunition. Kira saw me struggling and took my phone away, reminding me that Catherine's lies didn't change the facts and that the evidence packet would speak for itself. 2 days later, identical envelopes arrived from both insurance companies on the same afternoon. I opened mine standing at the mailbox and felt my stomach drop as I read the denial letter citing intentional act exclusions. My claim was denied because I deliberately built a device to cause property damage. Catherine's claim was denied because she created the dangerous connection herself. The financial reality hit me like a physical blow when I sat down with my calculator and added up the numbers. We were each looking at $15,000 to $25,000 in electrical repairs with zero insurance coverage. Our savings account, the one we'd been building for Hallie's college fund, was suddenly the only way to pay for this disaster. I had to walk into the kitchen where Kira was making dinner and tell her that my revenge just cost our daughter's education. She put down the knife she was holding and stared at me for a long moment before asking how much. When I told her the estimate range, she closed her eyes and leaned against the counter without saying anything for a full minute. Licensed electrician Harvey Morrow showed up the following Monday morning with his clipboard and voltage tester. He spent 2 hours examining both properties, taking measurements and photos, checking every outlet and breaker. When he finally gave us the quotes, I wanted to throw up right there in my driveway. Catherine needed a complete panel replacement and rewiring of all her damaged circuits for $22,000. I needed safety upgrades and inspection certifications for $8,000. Harvey explained that the power surge created cascading damage through Catherine's electrical system, frying multiple circuits and melting insulation in ways that would take weeks to fully repair. He was professional and factual about it, not judging either of us, just laying out the technical requirements and associated costs. Standing there looking at those numbers printed on his official estimate forms, I finally understood that winning the moral argument didn't matter if you bankrupted yourself proving the point. Inspector Howe came back later that week for a follow-up inspection. While he was checking my system's isolation switches, he mentioned there was a municipal mediation program specifically designed for code enforcement cases where both parties shared blame. He explained that successful mediation could reduce our fines and create payment plans. Plus, it would look better than having this go to criminal court if the DA decided to press charges. The word criminal made my hands shake and my chest tighten because I hadn't really processed that possibility until he said it out loud. I told him I was interested in any option that didn't end with me having a record and losing my family. Howe said he'd make the referral and that the mediator, Minerva Haley, was fair but didn't tolerate anyone who wasn't genuinely trying to resolve things. That night, Kira sat me down again at the same kitchen table. This time, her boundary was even clearer and her tone was harder. No more DIY electrical projects without professional oversight and permits. No more security traps of any kind. Period. She said Hallie needed a father who prioritized safety over revenge, and she needed a husband who could let go of grief long enough to be present for the family that was alive right now. I started to argue that I was just trying to protect us, but the words died in my throat when I saw how serious her expression was. She wasn't threatening or emotional, just stating facts about what she would and wouldn't accept. I realized sitting there that I was about to lose everything that mattered because I couldn't stop punishing someone for letting my first wife die 3 years ago. The next morning, I took Hallie to her therapy intake appointment with Lucille Stockton at the school counseling office. Watching my 8-year-old daughter try to explain why she was scared of police cars and worried the bad lady would hurt her new mommy absolutely destroyed me. She drew pictures with crayons showing our house surrounded by fire trucks and ambulances, all the emergency vehicles in red and blue. Then she asked me directly if I was going to jail, her voice small and shaky. I had to promise her that I was going to fix everything and keep everyone safe, even though I wasn't sure I could keep that promise. Driving home with her buckled in the back seat, I finally understood that my daughter had watched me become the thing that scared her instead of the parent who protected her from scary things. That realization felt worse than any citation or fine or insurance denial because it meant I'd failed at the one job that actually mattered. Later that week, I was standing in the hallway outside Hallie's bedroom, when I heard her ask Kira a question that stopped me cold. She wanted to know if Catherine was going to hurt Kira like she hurt her first mommy. The question was quiet, but clear, and I heard the fear in my daughter's voice. My daughter had connected Catherine's generator denial with her mother's death in her mind, and now she was terrified that my escalation with Catherine would somehow result in losing Kira too. I stood there frozen in the hallway, barely breathing, as Kira reassured Hallie that everyone was safe and that adults were handling things properly now. I realized that my revenge had taught Hallie that conflict meant danger and that adults solved problems by hurting each other. I was modeling exactly the kind of fear-based thinking that I'd wanted to protect her from after her mother died. That night I couldn't sleep, just stared at the ceiling in the dark while Kira breathed steadily beside me. I understood that I'd become my daughter's source of trauma instead of her safe place, and that truth was harder to face than anything else that had happened. My phone buzzed around midnight with a message from Cyrus Olson, one of the HOA board members I'd barely spoken to before all this started. He sent me screenshots showing Catherine's messages in a private board chat from 2 months earlier, long before she ever stole my electricity. The messages proved she'd been planning the mandatory power-sharing vote for months, deliberately scheduling it for the anniversary of my wife's death as a power play to assert her authority. The vindication felt good for about 30 seconds as I read through her calculated cruelty laid out in her own words. But then I set my phone down and looked at the dark ceiling again, and I realized that having proof Catherine was terrible didn't undo the damage I'd caused or fix my daughter's nightmares. Being right about Catherine's cruelty didn't make my response any less dangerous or my daughter any less scared. The screenshots were just more evidence that we'd both been wrong, just in different ways and at different times. 2 days later, an official envelope from the city arrived in my mailbox with a code enforcement hearing notice scheduled for 3 weeks out. I opened it standing right there by the mailbox and read through the formal language about reviewing violations and determining penalties for both properties. My phone rang while I was still reading, and Inspector Howe's number showed on the screen. He explained that Catherine got the same notice and we'd both be at the hearing, where outcomes could range from fines and required fixes to criminal charges if either of us didn't show we were trying to resolve things properly. His voice was calm and matter-of-fact as he walked me through what to expect, and something about the clear timeline and defined steps actually made me feel less panicked than I had in days. There was a process now, rules to follow, someone neutral who would look at facts instead of just emotions and anger. I went inside and marked the hearing date on the kitchen calendar in red marker, then pulled out a notebook and started listing every piece of paper and file I'd need to gather. Kira came home from work and found me at the dining table surrounded by folders and receipts, and I showed her the notice without saying anything. She read it twice, set it down carefully, and asked what we needed to do to prepare. That night, I stayed up until 2 in the morning making lists and organizing files like I was studying for the biggest test of my life, because in a way, I was. The school situation shifted about a week later when Hallie came home from lunch and told me that Trudy had said sorry to her in the cafeteria. My daughter's voice was quiet when she explained it, like she wasn't sure if she should believe it or if it was some kind of trick. She said Trudy had walked up to her table where she was sitting alone and apologized for saying mean things about me, then walked away before Hallie could even respond. I asked if any teachers were around, and Hallie nodded, saying the lunch monitor had been standing nearby watching the whole thing. That same afternoon, Lucille called me to report that the bullying had stopped and the school was monitoring both girls to make sure it stayed that way. She said Hallie seemed less tense in class and was starting to participate more in group activities instead of keeping to herself. Hanging up the phone, I felt a small weight lift off my chest because at least one piece of the damage I'd caused was getting fixed. Kira came into the kitchen while I was standing there holding my phone, and I told her about the apology. She reminded me that this was what happened when adults handled problems the right way, instead of through revenge, and even though her words stung, I had to admit she was completely right. The relief lasted exactly 2 days before a thick envelope arrived from an insurance company I didn't recognize. Inside was a civil demand letter on fancy letterhead, alleging that I had deliberately damaged Catherine's electrical system and demanding $35,000 in damages plus legal fees. My hands started shaking as I read through the formal accusations and dollar amounts, each line making the situation feel more real and more terrifying. This wasn't just the city citations anymore or the possibility of criminal charges. This was a whole separate lawsuit on top of everything else. I had to sit down at the kitchen table and read it 3 times before the full weight of it sank in. Then I called Kira at her office and heard the tiredness in her voice when I told her about the letter. She was quiet for a long moment before saying, we needed to find a lawyer, and I could hear other people talking in the background at her workplace. I realized, sitting there alone in our kitchen, that I'd dragged my whole family into a legal nightmare that could take years and tens of thousands of dollars to resolve, all because I couldn't accept that sometimes bad people get away with bad things and you just have to protect yourself and move forward. After we hung up, I sat there staring at the demand letter until the words blurred together, thinking about how much easier it would have been to just install proper security equipment instead of building a trap. I spent the entire next week building a complete file of everything that had happened from start to finish. I pulled out the original HOA denial letter from 3 years ago where Catherine had rejected my generator request, and I made copies of my first wife's death certificate, even though looking at it made my chest tight. Every receipt for my solar system went into the folder, organized by date and amount, showing exactly how much money I'd invested in keeping my family safe. The monitoring logs showing 3 weeks of power theft got printed out with timestamps and usage calculations highlighted in yellow. I took photos of the warning sign I'd posted before removing the decoy port, making sure the bright yellow "Private Grid Do Not Use" text was clearly visible. Then I wrote out a timeline of every attempt I'd made to resolve the theft before installing the trap, from the first conversation where Catherine laughed at me to the mediator suggestion that she'd ignored. Organizing everything into clear order by date felt helpful in a strange way, like I was turning all the chaos and anger into something concrete and factual. I made 3 copies of the whole file, one for the code hearing, one for the mediator whenever that got scheduled, and one for whatever lawyer we ended up hiring. Each evening I practiced explaining the whole situation out loud to Kira, trying to keep my voice calm and stick to just the facts without sounding like someone obsessed with revenge. Inspector Howe came back for a follow-up inspection on a Thursday morning and spent 2 hours walking me through proper ways to protect my solar system. He showed me transfer switches that would prevent any backfeed into other properties, isolation meters that would track exactly what power went where, and lockable panels that would physically prevent anyone from connecting to my system. Each option he explained patiently, drawing diagrams in his notebook and pointing out which parts of my current setup were dangerous versus which were just inefficient. He showed me how to add tamper alarms that would alert me if anyone tried to access the system but wouldn't discharge dangerous voltage at them. Watching him work and listening to his explanations, I understood that this was what I should have done from the very beginning instead of spending 3 nights building a trap in my workshop. The professional solutions he recommended cost more money and wouldn't give me the satisfaction of catching Catherine in the act, but they were legal and safe and wouldn't land me in court or destroy my marriage. I took detailed notes on everything he suggested and asked questions about installation requirements and permit processes. Before he left, he gave me a list of licensed contractors who could do the work properly, and he reminded me that having code-compliant security would look good at the hearing. I thanked him and meant it, because he was treating me like someone who'd made a mistake rather than like a criminal, and that small bit of respect made me want to actually do better. That evening, Kira surprised me by sitting down at the kitchen table with her laptop and a stack of printed articles about community power systems. She'd been researching while I was organizing my legal files, and she had an idea that made me stop and actually listen instead of just preparing my defense. She proposed that we pitch a community backup power program at the next HOA meeting, a voluntary system where neighbors could sign up to share emergency power during outages with proper safety equipment and training. She showed me technical requirements she'd found and liability protections that would keep everyone safe, presenting the whole thing as a way to turn the disaster into something that actually helped people. Her plan had details about opt-in participation and safety classes and proper electrical isolation, everything that Catherine's mandatory sharing vote had been missing. I sat there looking at her research and feeling amazed that she could see past all the conflict and anger to find an actual constructive solution. She'd been the adult in our marriage for months, while I was stuck replaying my first wife's death and planning revenge, and I was just starting to realize how much I'd been failing as a partner. The plan gave me something positive to focus on, instead of just defending myself and counting down to the hearing, and I told her I'd help however she needed. The next few days, I dove deep into researching how other neighborhoods had actually made shared power systems work without anyone getting hurt or sued. I found case studies from places that had set up community microgrids with proper engineering and clear rules about who could use what and when. The revenge story that had been driving me for 2 solid years started to fade as I got genuinely interested in designing something that could help everyone instead of just protecting my own family. I sketched out plans for a hub and spoke model where my system could be the central battery bank, but with safety locks and usage monitoring, so nobody could just steal power whenever they wanted. Each house that wanted to participate would need proper transfer equipment and safety training, and there'd be clear protocols for emergencies versus regular use. For the first time since my wife died, I was using my engineering knowledge to build something useful instead of to hurt someone, and it felt like remembering who I used to be before grief twisted me into the kind of person who rigs electrical traps. Kira would come home from work and find me surrounded by diagrams and calculations, and instead of looking worried, she'd look relieved that I was focused on creation instead of destruction. Once I had all my documentation organized into a complete file, I went down to the police station and filed a formal theft report with copies of everything. The officer who took my statement was professional, but made sure to note that both Catherine and I had committed violations and that my report didn't change what I'd done wrong. He explained that her stealing my power was a separate issue from my dangerous response, and both things could be true at the same time without canceling each other out. She'd wronged me by taking my electricity, and I'd crossed a line by building a trap that could have seriously hurt someone. It was frustrating to hear, but also fair in a way I was starting to understand, that being a victim doesn't give you permission to become someone who causes harm. The report went into an official case file, and the officer said it would be considered along with everything else when they decided whether to charge either of us with crimes. Walking out of the station, I felt slightly better having the theft documented officially, but I also felt the weight of knowing that documentation worked both ways, and there was plenty of evidence of my own bad choices. A reporter from the community newspaper called my cell phone 2 days later, asking for an interview about the HOA power dispute that led to an electrical fire. I politely told him I couldn't do an interview, but asked if I could send a written statement instead, and he agreed to consider it for the article. I spent over an hour writing and rewriting 3 paragraphs that acknowledged my wife's death, explained Catherine's theft, and took responsibility for responding with a dangerous trap. Every draft either sounded too defensive, like I was making excuses, or too apologetic, like I was admitting to being a monster. Finally, I settled on something simple and direct that explained the context without justifying what I'd done, finding a balance between being accountable and still advocating for myself. The hardest part was admitting fault publicly, while still making sure people understood I wasn't just some crazy person who attacked a neighbor for no reason. I sent the statement to the reporter and immediately forwarded it to Kira before I could second-guess myself. She read it during her lunch break and texted back that it made me sound like a real person who made a serious mistake rather than a villain or a victim, which was exactly what I'd been trying for. I posted a shorter version of the same statement to the neighborhood discussion forum that evening, carefully avoiding any language that blamed Catherine, while still laying out the basic facts of what had happened. I explained about my wife dying after the generator denial, about discovering the power theft, and about my poor judgment in building a trap instead of handling it through proper channels. I took full responsibility for creating a dangerous situation and said I was working with the city to make sure it never happened again. Then I closed my laptop and tried not to obsess over checking for responses. By the next morning, there were over 30 comments, and reading through them, I found a mix that surprised me. Some neighbors wrote that they understood the grief and anger even if they didn't think my method was right. Others stayed hostile and said I should be removed from the neighborhood for everyone's safety. But the overall tone had shifted slightly from pure anger and condemnation to something more complicated, with people actually discussing the situation instead of just attacking. It wasn't forgiveness, and I knew I didn't deserve that yet, but it was acknowledgement that the whole mess was more nuanced than just good guy versus bad guy. A few people even said they'd be interested in the community power program Kira had proposed, which gave me the first real hope that maybe something positive could come out of all this destruction. 3 days later, I got a text from Dinah Guerrero saying Catherine had gone to the emergency room that morning. My first reaction was a spike of worry that maybe the electrical surge had hurt her worse than anyone realized, but Dinah's follow-up message said it was stress-related high blood pressure and they'd already discharged her with medication. I stared at my phone, feeling this weird mix of concern and resentment churning in my stomach. Part of me genuinely didn't want Catherine to have serious health problems, but another part was annoyed that she was getting sympathy from neighbors while my daughter was still having nightmares and seeing a therapist twice a week because of Catherine's cruelty. I showed Kira the messages that evening while we were doing dishes, and she dried her hands and looked at me with that steady expression she gets when she's about to say something I need to hear but won't like. She reminded me that Catherine being wrong about everything didn't require her to suffer medical problems, and that wishing harm on her just kept me stuck in the same angry cycle that had led me to build the trap in the first place. I wanted to argue, but I knew she was right, so I just nodded and focused on scrubbing a pan harder than necessary. Later that night, lying in bed, unable to sleep, I realized that letting go of the anger toward Catherine was somehow harder than any engineering problem I'd ever tried to solve. because engineering had clear solutions and correct answers, while forgiveness was just this messy, uncomfortable thing with no manual. The next morning, I sat down at my kitchen table with a blank piece of paper and tried to write Catherine an apology note. 2 hours later, I had a recycling bin full of crumpled drafts and still nothing I was willing to send. Every version either sounded too defensive, like I was making excuses for what I'd done, or too groveling, like I was pretending the power theft never happened. I finally settled on 3 sentences that were simple and direct, without being either of those things. I wrote that I was sorry for creating a dangerous situation regardless of the provocation, that I was taking steps to ensure it never happened again, and that I hoped she recovered quickly from her health scare. I showed it to Kira before I sealed the envelope, and she read it twice, and then said it was good, and that was enough validation for me right now. I drove to the hospital and left the envelope at the front desk, addressed to Catherine with no return address, and no expectation of getting any reply. Walking back to my car, I felt lighter somehow, like I'd put down something heavy I'd been carrying without realizing it. A week after that, a thick envelope arrived from the city with official letterhead and the words, Municipal Mediation Program, printed across the top. The mediation was scheduled for 2 weeks out, and both Catherine and I were required to attend, along with Inspector Howe as a technical resource. The packet from mediator Minerva Haley explained the whole process with ground rules about respectful communication and potential outcomes ranging from voluntary agreements to formal recommendations for the Code Enforcement Board. Reading through all the documentation, I felt nervous, but also genuinely hopeful, because this was a structured process with a neutral third party keeping things fair, not just me and Catherine screaming accusations at each other in front of the HOA. Kira agreed to come with me for moral support, and over the next 2 weeks I practiced staying calm and focusing on solutions, instead of rehashing all my grievances about the generator denial and the power theft and the anniversary meeting. I wrote out talking points on index cards about what I wanted to accomplish, and Kira made me practice saying them without getting emotional or defensive. It felt silly at first, but by the time the mediation date arrived, I could explain my position in a steady voice without my hands shaking. The mediation session happened in a conference room at City Hall, and walking in, I saw Catherine already sitting on one side of the table, looking tired and older than I remembered. Minerva Haley was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and this calm, professional energy that immediately made the room feel less tense. Inspector Howe sat at the end of the table with his laptop and files, ready to provide technical context when needed. Minerva started by having us each explain our perspective without interruption, and I went first, because she said complainant usually does. I admitted that my trap was dangerous, and that I accepted full responsibility for the damage it caused, but I also laid out the 3 weeks of documented power theft, and my failed attempts to resolve it peacefully. When it was Catherine's turn, she admitted she'd installed the unauthorized connection and stolen power for 3 weeks, and her voice actually shook a little when she said it out loud in front of official witnesses. Minerva kept us focused on facts rather than emotions, redirecting us whenever we started sliding into blame or justification. Inspector Howe pulled up his investigation photos and explained how Catherine's jerry-rigged connection could have caused a fire even without my trap, because she'd bypassed safety systems and overloaded circuits that weren't designed for that kind of draw. For the first time, Catherine seemed genuinely shaken by the realization that her setup was dangerous on its own, and I saw her not as this monster who'd killed my wife, but as a stressed woman who'd made terrible choices under pressure. It didn't excuse anything she'd done, but it made her human in a way I hadn't been able to see before. We spent the next 2 hours drafting an agreement with Minerva's guidance, and the terms were painful but fair. I would fund the repairs to Catherine's electrical panel, since my trap had caused the immediate damage, which came to about $18,000 with a payment plan option. Catherine would pay restitution for the 3 weeks of stolen power, plus the cost of proper isolation equipment for my system, which totaled around $12,000 with her own payment plan. Both of us agreed to complete electrical safety training certified by the city before we could restore power to our properties. The numbers made my stomach hurt, because that was most of our savings gone, but having clear terms that we'd both agreed to felt infinitely better than the uncertainty of potential criminal charges hanging over everything. Minerva said she would recommend reduced fines to the Code Enforcement Board based on our good faith effort to resolve this through mediation, and I felt the first real hope in weeks that maybe we could get through this without completely destroying both families financially. Catherine signed the agreement first, and then I signed it, and we both got copies along with a letter Minerva would send to the Code Enforcement Board. The HOA board held a special meeting the following week, and I heard about the outcome through Cyrus Olson, who called me that evening. The board had voted to suspend Catherine from her leadership position pending a special election, citing her unauthorized power theft and poor judgment in scheduling the mandatory sharing vote on the anniversary of my wife's death. Cyrus had been appointed interim president, and he told me he was much more open to discussing the community resilience program Kira had proposed. I should have felt vindicated hearing that Catherine was finally facing consequences from the HOA itself, but mostly, I just felt sad and tired. Her downfall didn't bring back my first wife or undo the trauma Hallie had experienced, and I was learning that revenge was hollow even when someone else delivered it. What I really wanted was for my family to feel safe and for the neighborhood to have better systems, so this kind of conflict couldn't happen again, and Catherine losing her HOA position didn't accomplish either of those things. I thanked Cyrus for calling and asked him to send me the details about the resilience program discussion. Then I hung up and went to check on Hallie, who was doing homework at the kitchen table. The code enforcement hearing happened 3 weeks after the mediation, and walking into that hearing room, I felt my hands shaking, despite knowing we'd already worked out most of the details. The hearing officer reviewed Inspector Howe's findings and our mediation agreement, and then announced the fines. $3,500 for me, $5,000 for Catherine, both with payment plan options and compliance deadlines for completing all repairs and safety upgrades. Inspector Howe presented his investigation neutrally, just stating facts about code violations and safety hazards without taking sides. The board accepted our mediation agreement as evidence of good faith effort, and the hearing officer said that given our cooperation and the mediation outcome, he wasn't recommending criminal charges to the district attorney, but both violations would stay on our records. Walking out of that hearing room afterward, I felt like I could breathe fully for the first time in weeks, because the worst-case scenarios were finally off the table, and we had a clear path forward that didn't involve jail time or criminal records. Lucille Stockton called me 2 days later to schedule a meeting at the school with me, Kira, Catherine, and the parents of Catherine's granddaughter. The meeting was awkward from the start, with all of us sitting in those small elementary school chairs in Lucille's office, trying not to make eye contact. Catherine looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes, and her usual perfect appearance replaced by something more rumpled and human. Lucille explained that we were there to address the school situation and ensure the bullying didn't restart now that the adult conflict was moving toward resolution. Catherine actually apologized to Hallie through me, saying she never meant for the adult problems to affect the kids, and that she was sorry Hallie had been hurt by any of this. Her granddaughter's parents looked embarrassed and promised to monitor the situation closely and make sure there were no more incidents. It was uncomfortable sitting there accepting an apology that felt 3 years too late, but it was also adults finally taking responsibility for protecting children from adult problems, which was what should have happened from the beginning. Lucille gave both families printed resources for helping kids process conflict and stress, and I left feeling like maybe we could prevent more damage, even if we couldn't undo what had already happened. The Community Forum on Power Resilience happened on a Thursday evening at the community center, and I walked in with Kira to find about 40 neighbors already seated in folding chairs. The room was tense with competing opinions and lingering hostility from everything that had happened over the past month. Cyrus Olson stood at the front and called the meeting to order, establishing ground rules for respectful discussion and promising to moderate fairly. Kira went up to present the voluntary micro-resilience proposal she'd been working on, complete with proper safety protocols and opt-in participation so nobody would be forced into anything. Some people asked enthusiastic questions about costs and technical details, while others were openly skeptical about anything that involved shared resources. A few neighbors were still hostile to anything I was associated with, and I could see them whispering and shooting looks my way. But people were listening and asking real questions about liability and feasibility instead of just fighting, which meant we were having an actual discussion instead of just taking sides. It was progress, even if it was messy and incomplete and didn't feel like any kind of victory. When Cyrus called on me to speak, I stood up and walked to the front on shaking legs. I told the truth about losing my first wife 3 years ago and explained how grief and fear had turned into an obsession with backup power that eventually twisted into something destructive. I didn't try to justify what I'd done with the trap, but I explained the context of the 3-year anniversary and the theft and the sense of violation and powerlessness that had driven my choices. My voice cracked when I talked about Hallie asking if the bad lady would hurt her new mommy too, and I had to pause and take a breath before I could continue. I saw some faces in the audience soften when I mentioned my daughter, and a few people were nodding like they understood, even if they didn't agree with my methods. I wasn't asking for forgiveness because I knew I didn't deserve that yet, just understanding that I was a flawed person who'd made terrible choices while trying to protect my family, and that I was committed to doing better going forward. Several people nodded when I finished, and a few even looked sympathetic, which was more grace than I deserved after everything I'd done. Catherine stood up next and walked to the front with her shoulders tight and her hands clasped in front of her. She looked at the crowd for a long moment before she started talking, and her voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. She said she wanted to explain why she'd made the choices she did, not to excuse them, but just so people understood where it all came from. She talked about watching the neighborhood change over the past 5 years, seeing younger families move in with different ideas about community rules and property standards. She said she'd felt like everything she'd worked to build here was slipping away, and she didn't know how to stop it. The power theft was wrong, and she knew it, but at the time she'd convinced herself that if people saw how well shared resources could work, they'd support her mandatory sharing plan. Scheduling the vote on my wife's death anniversary was deliberately cruel, and she admitted that openly. She said she'd wanted to show me that she still had authority in this neighborhood when she felt that authority slipping through her fingers. She wasn't asking anyone to feel sorry for her, just trying to be honest about the fear and pride that had driven her to hurt people while trying to hold on to control. It was the most real I'd ever heard Catherine sound, without the polished HOA president voice or the defensive anger. I sat there listening and feeling my resentment clash with something else, maybe understanding that she was human and scared, just like I'd been human and scared. We'd both caused damage trying to protect what we thought mattered, and hearing her admit that made me see how similar we were, even though I didn't want to admit it. Several people in the audience were nodding, and I could see the mood in the room shift slightly from pure judgment to something more complicated. Cyrus stood up and thanked Catherine for her honesty, then called for the vote on the backup power proposal. The motion was to allow anyone to install code-compliant backup systems on their property without HOA approval, and to establish a voluntary emergency power-sharing hub at the community center with proper safety equipment and training. It wasn't forced sharing like Catherine had wanted, but it wasn't isolated individualism like I'd been practicing either. It was a middle path that respected people's right to protect their own families, while also building community resilience for emergencies. Cyrus called for a show of hands, and I watched as most of the room raised their hands in favor. The vote passed with maybe 35 out of 40 people supporting it. Kira volunteered right there to coordinate the technical planning committee, and several other neighbors raised their hands to help. Walking home that night with Kira beside me and Hallie holding my hand, I felt something unfamiliar and fragile. It was hope. Real hope that maybe we could build something better than what we'd lost. My wife's death had led to all this ugliness and pain, but now it might lead to a safer community where other families wouldn't face the same choice I'd faced 3 years ago. The path there had been terrible, and I'd done things I'd never forgive myself for, but at least something good might come from it eventually. Over the next week, the legal outcomes finalized, and I found myself sitting in a courthouse conference room, signing papers with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I pled guilty to misdemeanor property damage and got 18 months probation plus 200 hours of community service. Catherine accepted citations for code violations and signed agreements for restitution payments to cover what she'd stolen. Neither of us would face jail time, and both our records would be sealed after we finished probation successfully. The assistant district attorney explained that they'd considered our mediation agreement and cooperation as major factors in keeping the charges minimal. She said they could have pushed for felony charges given the danger I'd created, but the fact that we'd worked together to resolve things showed we were taking responsibility. I signed each page and felt grateful in a way that made my chest tight because my poor choices hadn't completely destroyed my future or my family. I promised myself sitting there that I'd use those 200 community service hours to actually help people instead of just punishing them. The DA handed us both copies of the final orders, and we left through different exits without speaking. Insurance companies released partial coverage letters 2 days after we submitted proof of the completed mediation agreement and repair contracts. They'd cover about 40% of the costs, since we'd both demonstrated good faith effort to resolve things properly through official channels. It wasn't full coverage, but it was something real, and it meant we wouldn't have to empty Hallie's college fund to fix the damage I'd caused. The out-of-pocket costs would still be significant, about $12,000 for us after insurance and payment plans, but Kira and I sat down at the kitchen table with our budget and figured out we could handle it. We'd have to cut back on some things and postpone the bathroom remodel we'd been planning, but it was manageable if we were careful. Having actual numbers instead of worst-case fears made the whole thing feel less like a disaster and more like a problem we could solve together. Kira squeezed my hand across the table and said we'd get through this, and I believed her. Harvey showed up on a Tuesday morning with his truck full of equipment to install a proper transfer switch and tamper alarm system on my solar setup. The work took 3 full days, and I watched him whenever I wasn't at work, learning how a licensed professional approached electrical safety. He replaced my dangerous decoy port with code-compliant security features that would protect my system without endangering anyone who tried to access it. The new system had alerts that would notify me if anyone tampered with the connections, but instead of discharging dangerous voltage, it would just disconnect and lock down. Harvey showed me the proper isolation equipment that prevented my backup power from accidentally feeding into the grid or neighboring properties. When he finished on Thursday afternoon, he walked me through the inspection certificate and explained each safety feature. Standing there looking at the professional installation, I felt like I was finally doing this the right way. I was protecting my family through proper engineering and code compliance instead of through revenge and traps. It cost more and was less satisfying than building something to hurt Catherine, but it was legal and safe and wouldn't get me arrested or divorced. That evening, Kira asked me to sit down at the kitchen table for a serious conversation about household rules and emergency protocols. She pulled out a notebook and said we needed to establish clear communication expectations about any future conflicts or safety concerns. She made me promise that if I ever felt that angry or scared again, I'd talk to her first before taking any action on my own. She said we needed to make decisions together as a team, not as individuals fighting separate battles. I agreed, and actually meant it this time, because I'd learned the hard way that my judgment got dangerously skewed when I was operating from grief and rage. We spent 2 hours writing down our protocols and discussing different scenarios and how we'd handle them. When we finished, Kira put the list on the fridge with magnets, concrete reminders that we were a family making choices together. Looking at those handwritten rules, I felt safer than any electrical system had ever made me feel. A few weeks later, I noticed Hallie sleeping through a thunderstorm without waking up screaming. Kira noticed it too, and we stood in her doorway watching her sleep peacefully while rain pounded the roof. The next morning, Hallie came downstairs and ate breakfast without checking to make sure Kira was still breathing, something she'd been doing compulsively since the night of the fire trucks. Lucille called me that afternoon to say the therapy was helping and that kids were resilient when they felt safe and supported. Watching my daughter gradually relax and smile more often did more to heal my guilt than any legal resolution could. She wasn't jumping at sirens anymore, and she'd stopped asking if bad things were going to happen to Kira. She drew pictures of our house with sunshine and flowers instead of fire trucks and emergency vehicles. I kept every single drawing and hung them on my workshop wall as reminders of what actually mattered in life. My community service assignment came through in early fall and turned out to be co-teaching backup power safety workshops with city staff at the community center. The irony wasn't lost on me, but it was actually perfect for what I needed to do. I spent Saturday mornings teaching neighbors about proper electrical safety, code compliance, and how to install backup systems without creating hazards. People asked good questions about battery capacity and solar panel efficiency and transfer switch installation. Some of them even thanked me afterward for sharing practical knowledge that would help them protect their own families. I realized, standing there answering questions, that I was better at helping people through education than I'd ever been at punishing them through traps. The work was satisfying in a way revenge had never been, because I was building something useful instead of just tearing something down. Catherine showed up to fulfill her own community service hours at the third workshop. We made eye contact when she walked in and nodded at each other without speaking. She took over the registration table while I focused on technical instruction at the front of the room. We maintained polite distance while working on different aspects of the program, never directly interacting unless we had to coordinate something practical. It wasn't forgiveness on either side, just two people who'd hurt each other learning to occupy the same space without causing more damage. Occasionally, we'd exchange brief information about scheduling or materials, and that was enough. We didn't need to be friends or enemies, just neighbors who'd learned expensive lessons about boundaries and consequences. The civil claims finally settled after 2 months of negotiation between lawyers and insurance adjusters. Both insurance companies accepted the mediation terms and established payment schedules for restitution and repairs. Catherine and I both signed non-disparagement agreements, promising not to publicly attack each other or relitigate the conflict in neighborhood forums or social media. My lawyer called to say it was a good outcome given how badly things could have gone, and I had to agree even though signing away my right to complain about Catherine felt frustrating. But I was tired of fighting, and I wanted to focus on my family and the positive community work I'd started. I signed the papers and filed them away in a folder labeled Closed Cases, the official end of our war. The HOA culture gradually cooled over the following months. Some neighbors remained distant, and I doubted they'd ever fully trust me again. But others actively thanked me for the safety workshops and the push for better backup power policies. Dinah stopped me after one Saturday workshop and told me she was installing her own solar system using the guidelines we developed. She said 3 other families on her street were considering it too. The neighborhood wasn't unified and probably never would be, but it was functional, and people were talking about practical solutions instead of just taking sides. I'd accepted that I'd never be popular here, but I could be useful, and that was enough. On a quiet Sunday morning, I took Hallie and Kira to visit my first wife's grave for the first time since the incident. We drove in silence and parked near the headstone. I talked honestly about my guilt and anger and the mistakes I made trying to honor her memory. My voice cracked, but I kept going. Hallie put flowers on the headstone and said her first mommy would be proud that Daddy was being safer now. She said we were okay and that she loved her. Kira held my hand while I apologized out loud for letting grief turn me into someone who hurt people. I promised to do better at protecting our family through love and proper planning instead of through rage and revenge. Standing there between my past and my future, I finally felt like I could move forward without betraying either one. A brief power outage occurred during a summer storm 3 weeks later. My backup system kicked in smoothly while the rest of the neighborhood went dark. I texted Catherine the address of the new community power hub as a courtesy. She texted back a simple thank you without any other words. Several other neighbors stopped by the hub to charge phones and medical devices. The system worked exactly as designed. It safely provided emergency power through proper protocols. Watching it function correctly gave me more satisfaction than the revenge ever did because this actually helped people instead of just making me feel powerful. I gradually turned off the excessive security alerts and monitoring that I'd been obsessing over for 2 years. I trusted the proper safety systems instead of staying in constant watch mode. For the first time since my first wife died, I slept through the night without checking battery levels or reviewing security footage. Kira noticed the change and commented that I seemed calmer. She said I was more present with her and Hallie. She was right. I was finally letting go of the constant worry that kept me in fight mode for 3 years. The house felt safer, not because I had better defenses, but because I wasn't constantly preparing for war. 6 months after pushing that button, I sat in my workshop looking at the control panel that I'd reprogrammed for real safety functions instead of revenge. I understood now that I couldn't undo the harm I caused, but I could learn from it. My first wife died because of someone else's cruelty and bureaucratic indifference. That would always be true and always be unfair, but I almost became the person who causes someone else that same kind of preventable harm. Catching myself on that edge had pulled me back from becoming the villain in someone else's tragedy. Seeing the smoke and the scared neighbors and my daughter's tears had stopped me. The line between justice and revenge was clearer now. It was drawn in scorch marks and citation papers, and my daughter's slowly returning smile. I couldn't fix the past, but I could make sure our house was genuinely safe and our community was stronger. Maybe that was the only kind of resolution that actually mattered. Not perfect endings, but people learning to do better after they've done their worst.